Good afternoon to all. Distinguished guests,
Καλησπέρα σε όλους.
Niarchos Foundation, I would like to welcome you all to the official presentation of Theodore Pelagidis and Michael Mitsopoulos' book, Greece, From Exit to Recovery, ? The book is part of the Brookings Institution's European Growth Project, which has been supported by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. The project aimed to examine the unfolding consequences of the euro crisis by focusing on the countries that were impacted the most by it, Greece, Italy, and Spain, while examining at the same time a number of issues in relation to the crisis that were of great concern to Germany and France. The research work has culminated in the publication of two manuscripts. Theodore Pelagidis, Brookings non-resident senior fellow, and Michael Mitsopoulos' Greek From Exit to Recovery, and a volume of essays, case studies on wider economic issues and reform in the Eurozone, as well as on the financial sector and social policies, entitled Europe's Crisis, Europe's Future. Before I ask the Foundation's President, Andreas Drakopoulos, to offer some opening remarks, I would like to say a few words about the two authors and also mention today's panelists. Theodore Pelagidis is a professor of economics at the University of Piraeus and a non-resident senior fellow in global economy and development at Brookings. He has also been a NATO scholar at the Center for European Studies of Harvard University, a Fulbright scholar at Columbia University, and an NMBG professional fellow at the London School of Economics. Michael Mitsopoulos is an economist at the Hellenic Federation of Enterprises and has taught at the Economic University of Athens and the University of Piraeus. He holds a PhD in economics from Boston University. Pelagidis and Mitsopoulos are co-authors of Understanding the Crisis in Greece, From Boom to Bust. Now, as far as today's panelists go, we have Angelos Athanasopoulos, editor and columnist in the Athenian daily To Vima, Josep Borrell, former Spanish minister, former president, European University Institute, Jean Monnet Chair in European Economics, Universidad Complutense of Madrid, Kemal Dervish, Vice President and Director, Global Economy and Development, Brookings Institution, and Katerina Sokou, Washington, D.C. correspondent of the Athenian Daily Kathimerini, as well as the two authors. And now, I would like to ask the President of the Foundation, Mr. Andreas Drakopoulos, to offer some opening remarks. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, good afternoon and welcome to the official presentation of Theodore Pelagidis and Michael Mitsopoulos' book, Greece, From Exit to Recovery. And yes, there should be, and there is indeed, a question mark, given the still extremely high levels of unemployment, poverty, and debt, while at the same time, growth is anemic at best. The book has been published by Brookings as part of the European Growth Project, which has been supported by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. Before we proceed, I would like to thank Kemal Dervish and Bill Antholis, as well as their colleagues at the Brookings Institution, for their collaboration on this project. Kemal's oversight and extensive involvement in every phase of this project in general, and the specific book in particular, have played a critical role in its successful and timely completion. I also wanted to thank both the authors and the rest of the panelists for accepting our and Brookings' invitation to participate in this panel. The Foundation and Brookings started to discuss this project almost 2.5 years ago, in the midst of Greece's unprecedented socioeconomic crisis. We both realized that we needed to look back and understand the reasons that brought Greece to its knees. At the same time, we also perceived this project as a great opportunity, not only to understand in depth the crisis and its different parameters, but to also try and draw some valuable lessons about the future, and most importantly, to identify effective means for the Greek economy to recover and become competitive again. Pelagidis' and Mitsopoulos' book is not simply a description and a straightforward analysis of the crisis. We have seen numerous of such efforts already, and we are bound to see many more. Greece, From Exit to Recovery focuses on recognizing the inherent weaknesses and problems that existed and defined Greece's accession to the Eurozone, searches for and points out structural deficiencies in the current adjustment and austerity measurements, and provides suggestions such as on how research-based innovation can restore competitiveness to the Greek economy without relying on the suppression of labor costs. In doing so, the authors have written an astute and original analysis destined to define the public debate on Greece and the current crisis. I do hope that all of us in the audience tonight could have an opportunity to gain a better perspective on the book and the timely issues it raises. Thank you.
Kemal, please.
Thank you very much, and let me add my thanks to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for supporting this work in the best possible way, both intellectually and with their whole resources. And I think it's a timely moment to get together today because we are in a much better situation than 2 years ago in Greece and in Europe, but a huge amount remains to be done. But I think now there is enough optimism, enough belief that it can be done. And so the discussion of how it can be done acquires the kind of urgency that it deserves. We will have our own perspectives on the panel in a little while, but we'll start now with Ted and Michael presenting their book, which is really a very great book, and I hope you will all be able to read it. And it's a book that looks at the past, because one has to, of course, take lessons from the past. But the main focus of this whole work has been to look ahead of how to reach better days, much better days for Greece and for Europe, because it is within a European framework that the whole situation has evolved, both the bad days and the good days. So Ted, over to you, and then we will give our comments later on.
15 minutes, Ted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me take the opportunity and thank Brookings, and especially what I call my troika, Kemal, Jacques, and Domenico, who is not here today, for the guidance, help, and encouragement during the last couple of years, and of course, Niarchos Foundation, not only for financial support, especially Stelios Vasilakis, has actively participated in all workshops, offered comments, suggestions, and generally helped a lot. It was a great experience for Mike and I working with you. Thank you again. So the book got only 15 to 20 minutes. You said, Kemal, I will try to give some points, critical points. The book is divided in 3 sections. I will present the first 2 of them. The first section focuses on the pre-crisis period up to 2008. According to the mandate we had from Brookings. The second on the Troika period, what we call the depression of the century, 2010, 2013. So, all right, these are the so-called the key questions addressed in section 1. What did the IMF, EU, and ECB say about the Euro accession of Greece and its performance in the Euro area? A failure before the program? Question mark again. Could 2010 have been foreseen? And were Greek politicians aware of costs for Greece to join the single currency and the reforms that should be done? Question mark again. As far as the first 2 questions, the research in both classified and unclassified documents have shown that the IMF commended Greece for structural reforms in product markets in 2007 and praised the related progress made in 2008, 2009, despite the fact that the government legislative initiatives at the time, and especially from 2004, 2009, was to actually add numerous legal obstacles and institutional uncertainties to doing business. But the IMF kept on offering positive recommendations. The EU and the ECB increasingly became sterner, but for too long they also were politically polite, let's say. If the failure could be foreseen, the ratification of the treaty and acceptance of Greece in the euro area, no. As time passed by, increasingly, yes. As far as the third question, were Greek politicians aware of costs for Greece to join the second currency? and the reforms that should be done, our research has shown that politicians did know both the risks of Greece's accession to the Eurozone and the structural reforms needed, and that's impressive. But they did they did very little things, we would say, especially during 2010. Why? Again, you need to understand, this is our theory with Mike. Since 2005, we have written our first book, Rent-Seeking in Greece, and then explaining the Vikings phenomenon in Greece. You need to understand the role of the organized interests, the Vikings, the phenomenon of massive free riding, the state as a plunder in Greece, the extended trade of favors, which is a very important element, the role of the media, and the dominance of rent-seeking structures in general. You need to understand all this, all the mechanics of the political system, otherwise you're going to be surprised by the results of your policy prescription. As for chapter 2, the key questions were, did the MOU solve problems? Did the Troika create new problems? Did the Troika worry about new problems, and what now? I would like you to just keep in mind that Eurozone is not a perfect monetary union, that the euro is a hard currency for Greece, and that the surplus countries like Germany deny to reflate in Eurozone and have gathered a large part of available liquidity in Eurozone. And there was at the time over-reliance on foreign funds, making Greece extremely vulnerable to changes in lending conditions. So section 2, which we call from the depression of the century, from La Dolce Vita to collapse, focuses initially on the economic performance of the country, which in brief presents a Janus phase. On the one hand, high growth rates. On the other, as you can see for yourself, increasing institutional weaknesses and a worsening in competitiveness indices such as the inflation rate, the inflation differential concerning goods sector, which means it was not a Balassa-Samuelson effect, a 2% differential with Eurozone countries, the current account and the budget deficit of 15% of GDP. These are well-known things, FDI practically zero, etc. The politicians love bubbles, but every bubble has its burst. So we ended up, as is well known, with the huge domestic income expenditure disparity, which was reflected in the huge 15% of GDP twin deficits. So Greece, at least in the short term, at the time, had to devalue. And since monetary accommodation was not an option, I had to devalue internally. The question at the time was which elements of cost to devalue. That is, the wages, administrative costs, what else, how much, and what other growth-driven policies are needed at the time. And don't forget, in case you devalue internally, you have to confront Vikings, always. That is the official and unofficial groups, organized free riding, rent-seeking groups, etc. So we embark on the depression of the century, must have cash to help this country face a solvency problem, lost all on the stock market, lost on the previous Dolce Vita period. The thing is that the Troika approves, in fact, what we call the business as usual way of adjustment. In other words, since the inception of the crisis, the creditors let the Greek government do business as usual, as they were urgent to save the too big to fail Eurozone banks and cancel any spillover effects on the rest euro area. In this context, they in fact approved the circumvention of the MOU regarding cutting waste in the public sector and do structural reforms, and instead allow a tax anything that moves bonanza. See for yourself there, this is an indicative only list of new taxes, and I repeat, an indicative only. As a result, sectors that contribute significantly to exports, like metals, are hit by large energy cost increases, which are entirely due to excise tax increases, So for a few dimes, you lose employment, you lose social security contribution, you lose taxable profits. This is not, we consider this is not a smart deal. Internal devaluation might have been successful with constant indirect taxes. You see the cost divergence now, it's Greece is with, it's the pink color, so that doesn't work very well. So the cost divergence is in favor of Greece now. But this is a hypothetical scenario. Failure number 2, which we can name it internal devaluation fighting itself, which also included a collateral damage, we would say. So devalue internally, and mainly in an horizontal, blind, last-minute way. And at the same time, taxing heavily the productive sector of the economy leads to high inflation and lower competitiveness. And the collateral damage, which is also a $1 million question, is how a country with the depression of the century can at the same time pay back a stock of maturing bonds. Again, there is an inherent contradiction between debt sustainability and real depreciation. This is another contradiction of the policy. Yeah, it's not the multiplier is stupid, with no competitiveness boost, efforts to improve fiscal positions, all which end up to large negative multiplier effects, given that there is no interest rate at exchange rate channels to offer any offsets. So they have come up with the great idea that labor cost is the main culprit. But however, as you can see for yourself, this is the cost component for metal industry. The unit labor cost is not the most important cost component for metal companies and industries. For example, it's only 10 to 15% of total cost, as you can see there. But really, was labor cost ever such a big issue for the economy as a whole? This is where failure 3 is nested. You see for yourself, private sector wages were never such a big issue. The gap between the Eurozone and Greek wages is opening since 2010, and is now 46%, as Michael said before, lower. And something else, wage cuts are not the number, or was not the number one problem of the private economy, also because of the huge self-employment in Greece, double the Eurozone number here again. So, yes, how did they miss this? Greece has the lowest wage share, 18.6%. And the highest administrative cost, 6.8%, as you can see in this table. In some, we could say that there was an obsession with internal devaluation of private sector wages, and this is revealed here, and unfortunately not with growth-enhancing progressive structural reforms. Now let me focus on the fourth failure and be more specific about progressive structural reform. We say progressive and not just structural reforms. First of all, OECD offers indisputable evidence that you first break the rigidities, the monopolies and the oligopolies in the product market and the professional market. You improve and simplify relative legislation, and then you go and re-regulate or deregulate. I prefer the word re-regulate the labor market if needed accordingly. But deregulating labor market in the middle of an emerging depression of minus 25% of GDP, even though they are not number one problem because of huge self-employment we saw before, etc. But don't cut waste. Don't lift entrepreneurial barriers. Don't reform education. Don't reform aggressively, especially during 2010, 2012. That simply leads you to sky-high unemployment of 27%. Another slide here showing that the result is also an even larger than planned reduction in real wages. See the left panel here, the blue line. As prices move much more sluggishly, again, the blue line the right panel. And again, another one slide, which is called myth-busting, another myth-busting graph on the same issue. In levels, private sector wages in Greece were relatively low, even in 2009. Look at that. So even more, if you took out state-sponsored sectors like energy, utilities, etc. So, responding to key questions of Chapter 2. No, the policy initially did not set out to solve the main problems of the economy, unfortunately. It focused initially only on tax increases and falling wages in the private sectors, which we saw before. It ignored for too long non-wage costs, which are very important and very sky-high administrative costs we have in Greece, in spite of the hard evidence. And especially the IMF seems not to have had structural reforms as a priority, both in the period 1999-2009, in the report, and even after 2009, especially the first period, 2010-2012. So private sector wages and taxes were its priorities. Sorry, but in fact they approved the government policy by not pressing the government to do the right thing. That's why we are saying in section 2 that the government and the Troika goes hand in hand in kicking the can down the road. Yes, the MOU, particularly as implemented by the government at the time, I'm talking about mainly the period 2010-2012, created some new problems. Increases in taxes and prices of state monopoly, yes, run energy brought lately stagnating the exports, especially for the last year. A free fall of asset prices you cannot privatize because of that. You can't imagine the complication of all the new tax laws. Michael has to tell you, a couple of stories about that. Grexit talk in 2012 destroyed a large part of a healthy private sector, which is actually the tax base of the economy. Overall, the productive sector was left to die, even while the corrupt and bloated state, sorry to say that, received an unprecedented help to keep operating as usual, business as usual. So the moral hazard one should worry about is here. And now the balance of power. The balance of power now is even worse than it was in 2010. The pie is smaller, the GDP pie is smaller, and the rotten network is more cynical and ruthless. Oh, and always same people, simply in different power key position, unfortunately. What now? Another worrying thing is that we're still dealing with the depression or the stagnation as if it is still were a sovereign debt crisis, and in our view, it's not a sovereign crisis. The issue is not debt sustainability so much right now, and Michael Mitsopoulos has written a lot about that. The key is to finance again the productive economy, putting it back on track. The irony is that of the story is that the new problems canceled the positive effect of the structural reforms in 2013. Some structural reforms actually implemented. You see some examples below, selected by Michael, worth seeing. But still we have sky-high interest rates. This is the difference between the national with EU average. You see Greece here and Cyprus also. And private sector cost of money, this is a slide that Michael has shown before, and energy costs crowds out falling wages and employment. The red line is the difference. So it's Michael's turn to present chapter 3, yeah. All right, we'll do that.
Hi, thank you.
We needed something new about the future.
Yes. I really want to spend 1 second on this. You see how you have falling employment and falling wages. Usually when wages fall, employment goes up. But here, employment and wages go down. And the big explanation for that is the financial strangulation of the private sector. So basically, by suffocating financially the private sector, you lose all the benefits from the pain and the adjustment in the wages. So with all that said, and given the time constraint, I move to section 3. Section 3 selects a specific topic. The idea is there are so many studies about the future of growth in Greece, McKinsey, Jove, Boston Consulting Group. We selected one specific topic to make a deep dive on it, and basically it is looking beyond the stereotypes of, say, shipping and tourism. This doesn't mean you don't need this, but we want to complement on this. Here you can see, according to the Bank of Greece data, it's what you got into the country in 2013 from shipping, tourism, and exports. So everyone says about shipping and tourism, but you see that actually non-fuel exports is more than either of the others. And if you put fuels on it, Greece doesn't yet have fuels at substantial amounts, but it has refineries. You can see how important exports are actually as a size. Now, the focus of Chapter 3 is in particularly innovation-driven production and the collaboration with research centers, so research-based innovation. And you can see how little businesses spend on R&D in Greece now with respect to the euro area average. So you really would have to fill this big gap to become average. And the big question of Chapter 3 is, why is this not happening? And we try to find answers to this question.
Couple of minutes, please.
Yes. And what you can see is that Greece has in place some components that you would need to get this ecosystem of innovative production working. For example, you have some suppliers, you have infrastructure, you have quality of research institutions, value chain, but you miss out on others, which are basically aspects of where production and research come together. Companies spending on R&D, university industry, innovations. So it's this unevenness that motivates Chapter 3. So we go through a literature review, we check a number of variables with econometrics if they can work. What we find is that a lot of topics that the literature finds as important, they come up as important also from our analysis. You need specialized funding. Of course, you can't have specialized funding if the bulk financing of the boring daily activities is sick, so you need to restore financing as a whole. And you need value chain breadth, but Greece has some value chain breadth. And you need quality of research institutions, but Greece has some of these. Education system, okay, there are some problems here. And of course, you need fixed issues like regulation, and you need competition, because competition is the motivation for the markets to go down innovation and spend on the research and use it to innovate. And the data, the analysis tells us exactly that these things that are being picked up by the literature, we also find them in the numbers. And behind these, there are a number of other variables that pop up as important. It's the usual stuff that has to do with the quality of the state, the quality of institutions, how government is effective, corruption, and all these things. So these need to be fixed. For example, corruption, control of corruption is a very mild priority in the MOU, for example. It should be number 1. And what we find in the end is that there is actually a tangible opportunity there. There are some elements that can be used in Greece. There are some things missing, so what we have to do, we have to fill out the things that are missing before the things that are there can die out. And a lot of the things that are there now, the capacities have been state-funded, state funding has dried up. So the thing is you have to get, remove the barriers so that the private sector can move in, fill the financing gap, and keep these assets of the country that can create high-value jobs and growth alive. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like now to open the floor to each one of the panelists to comment on the presentation and on the book in general. Please be brief and concise. Thank you. Joseph? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting to the presentation of this book, to the discussion that we hold before, and to the exchange of views, I hope, with the public. The book is an important contribution to the analysis of what has happened in Greece what could happen to Europe, and in general, what is happening in the south of Europe is Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, maybe France, and also, although it's not in the south, in Ireland. We have gone out of the acute phase of the crisis. The euro is not going to die. A couple of years ago, it was not so clear. But today, nobody is thinking about the implosion of the euro area. The acute phase is over. But we have entered in a chronic phase of the crisis, with high unemployment, low growth, and very weak prospects for the future. And the problem is how long can the societies of the south of Europe, the Greek society in particular, resist the stress of this situation? Because although the macroeconomic indicators can show that there is a little hope, a little light out of the tunnel, the reality is that the social situation is very bad in Greece and also in my country, in Spain. And there is, we can say, a kind of a speed, a course of speed between the recovery and the social capacity to resist until the recovery comes. The book analyzes very well, and your presentation has summarized the content of the book about how things has happened. I can add to your explanation my belief that till a certain point this is a self-inflicted crisis, that we Europeans, we have managed the crisis in a wrong way. We have increased the problems, and we have produced dynamics in which austerity produces recession, recession requires more austerity, and we are still on this kind of negative feedback. I've been wondering what would have happened if Mr. Trichet had said in the summer 2010 what Mr. Draghi said in the summer 2012. Exactly the same words. I will do whatever it takes to save the euro, and believe me, it will be enough. These words, pronounced in the summer 2012, had they been pronounced in the summer 2010 or even in 2011, maybe we could have spared the crisis. It's quite dramatic to say such a thing, because if it is the case, why Mr. Trichet didn't say exactly the same thing that Mr. Draghi said 2 years later? At that time, we were still on the mood of the Greeks has been cheating us, so before we help them, we have to punish them. And this is a part of the approach, a wrong approach, which has been used. Greece was the perfect guilty. I remember when we were negotiating the Maastricht Treaty with the Germans and other European countries, and they were having in mind the fears that maybe you will not be able to resist the competitive stress that represents to be part of a monetary union and having to face much more competitive economy. And in fact, they didn't want us into the Eurozone. When I say us, I mean the Mediterranean club. No? They call us the Med club. No? Are you sure you really want to become member of the Euro area? Are you sure? Do you mind? What does it mean? It means that if you have a problem, and you will have a problem, then you will not be able to solve it as you are used to do by just managing the value of the currency. You will not be able to devaluate as you have always been doing. Are you sure you will keep under control the fiscal balances? Are you sure you will not lose competitivity because you are going to have more inflation than others? why don't you get out of the Eurozone? It's too much for you. But we insisted on becoming a member of the Eurozone because at that time it was like a kind of World Cup, football World Cup. No? You are not a member of the Eurozone, you are nobody. And everybody fought to be a member of the Eurozone, believing that it was a kind of a sprint. You run very quickly in order to fulfill the requirements of the convergence. And once you fulfill the requirement, you are in, and that's over. But it was not a sprint, it was a marathon. Once you are in, you have to continue running in order to keep facing the fact that you are competing with much more competitive economies, and you have to share a currency with an over-evaluated exchange rate that damage your competitivity with respect to third countries. So,
couple of minutes, please.
Yes.
Thank you.
Greece was the perfect guilty, but you were not so guilty. Till a certain point you were, but if you want to get out of the crisis, if we want to get out of the crisis, it's not only your effort, it's only the changes required in the general setting of the European Union.
Thank you, Kemal.
Let me try to share a few perspectives from my own experience. My first policy crisis that I lived when I was at the World Bank, a young economist trying to help, was in Mexico, 1985. Angel Gurria, who's now the head of the OECD, was at that time the chief debt negotiator. And severe crises around the world, including, of course, the one in Turkey in 2001, 2002, where I had to take direct national responsibilities. So looking at crisis, let me try to share some experienced throughout this work. The first thing that is almost invariably true is you get a lot of overshooting in a crisis. And, you know, variables overshoot. If there's a flexible exchange rate, the devaluation is larger than it really has to be. The stock market collapses much more and then recovers. I'm sure those of you who are in the stock market wished you had invested heavily in the US stock market in 2008, October. It shows how these things overreact. And in that sense, provided you survive, because sometimes you don't survive the crisis, the country falls apart. You have had situations like that in the 30s where extremely bad political regimes take over. But provided that doesn't happen, when the worst is over, there is hope for a much more rapid recovery, actually, than anybody maybe expects. And in that sense, I feel that in Greece I can feel now the possibility of that. Not the certainty, but the possibility, although belief in it is still very shaky, and of course it depends on many variables. The second point is really the importance of the policy mix. And here the book, I think, gives a very good contribution. If you get your policy mix wrong, you can do a lot of damage. And it doesn't have to do that much, you know, or anything at all, frankly, with inherent characteristics of nations or people or DNA. I mean, I've heard a lot of nonsense talk about Greece. And let me just remind you that the worst recessions in the last few decades is still the big recession in the US. Okay? Nobody claimed that in the 30s the Americans were not hard workers or were too corrupt or whatever. It was a huge policy mix mistake that landed the US in that huge depression. So let's not underestimate the importance of policy. And I think that's one point the book makes very well with examples. And the third connected point is the importance of psychology and expectations. At the end of the day, recovery depends on people willing to invest. And regulation is important, the tax system is important, but let's face it, if the overall psychology is negative, if there isn't a belief that, you know, this country is going to move on and grow and do well, then if that psychology isn't there, the amount of investment you get, domestic and foreign, is going to be limited. So these are some of the points which I think, worldwide you can take home from the experience of crisis, and I think they are relevant for Greece. The policy mix of the past, we can't change it. What has been done is done. I think I agree with the authors, that it was a policy mix that way too much emphasized austerity measures and not enough the real structural changes. I wouldn't perhaps blame the IMF as much as the authors do. Well, they blame the Troika actually, but the intellectual driving force of the Troika was the IMF. Because the IMF at the end of the day, is in a funny position. If it interferes too much in the details of the policies inside the country, we rightly criticize this for interfering. These are our sovereign decisions. So they then tend to say, okay, well, you do whatever you like in terms of structure and micro, but on the macro side, there are some limits you have to observe. How you want to observe them with what kind of mix is your business. And in that sense, I think internal national decisions are the ones that should be driving structural reforms, not recipes that are coming from abroad. And having said that, I think the movement now is to focus on should be to focus on the supply side, on the product markets, on competition, on technology. No country in the 21st century can achieve success without some degree of success in technology, knowledge, and a knowledge-based economy, because that's what the 21st century is all about. And so Greece is not going to compete in the world on the basis of very low wages. It's a European country, it's an OECD country. It has to compete, of course, with reasonable wages on the front of knowledge, technology, and the kind of niches it can get in the international value chain. And the final point is Europe. And here I'm going to give a kind of comparison which is not totally valid, but I think which makes a point. That if when you are part of the Eurozone, of a monetary union, of an economic bloc, which isn't quite a national bloc yet, you cannot do it alone. That bloc itself has to be successful. If the Europe as a whole is unsuccessful, it's hard that even Germany will not be able to successful in the medium term. But inside the bloc, there is some degree of mutualization that's needed. And the example I want to give is the US. Okay, there are many differences between the federal system in the US and the Eurozone, but take deposit insurance in the banks. In the US, as you know, there's federal deposit insurance up to, per bank, $100,000, and you can have many accounts. Now, suppose that this insurance was not federal, but each state had its own insurance. Do you think anybody would feel safe in a bank in Missouri or in some of the poorer states, West Virginia or so on? Just also because of scale, maybe not even in Connecticut. It's the fact that the insurance is federal that makes people feel safe, and you don't have to spend actual money. Once people feel safe, you actually don't need transfers. It's only when there's a crisis and there's a run on the bank, then you may have to step in. But as long as the confidence subsists, the fact that you're putting the full faith of the United States behind the federal deposit insurance is enough. The same goes for bonds. If the US, the sovereign bonds of the US are now fetching very low interest rates for years. Suppose each state was trying to emit its own bond, a Connecticut bond, a Florida bond, Kansas bond. It wouldn't work, or it would be much more difficult. New York and California would be able to sell their bonds, Texas, because it has a lot of oil. Many of the other states would have a problem, okay? So the point I want to make about Europe, if it wants to succeed to have a monetary union that functions, it has to adopt some common commitments in the banking area, in the fiscal area, to back up the monetary union and the euro. You cannot have the ECB having taken away the monetary sovereignty from all the components of the Eurozone. You've lost your central bank. France has lost its central bank, okay? Why is the UK able to, UK been able to be so creditworthy when its deficit was huge compared to many Eurozone countries? Because it had the Bank of England there printing money if needed. Once you lose that, you need to go the further step and mutualize some of the fiscal space. And I think this is an absolute necessity for the Eurozone as a whole to be successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kemal. Katerina, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation, and especially thank you to the Niarchos Foundation and Brookings for the initiative to publish such a book, which is still timely and handy, actually, but quite dense in information and policy proposals. And I would actually, given that it's calling for change in the design of the Greek adjustment program, if I may take some copies back to Washington for my sources at the IMF, it would be very good, I think. Now, this is not a book for economists only. I think it's written by economists and very good ones for that, but it's also for policymakers. And they provide them actually the data to draw policies, and importantly, in this current juncture, the arguments to make their case to their lenders. Now, I was particularly taken aback by the second chapter, which is about the prejudices and the misguided policies that led to what the authors call the depression of the century, a Greek Great Depression. So, in many ways, I wish this book was available in the Greek government, to the Greek government and the Troika back in 2010, because it actually shows with data that the competitiveness troubles of the Greek economy were not much deeper than the labor cost, which you can make an argument there. And the focus of the internal devaluation on the earnings and the number of private sector employees was actually counterproductive, as it reduced tax revenues and the social security contribution of these people. That's even more frustrating given that the small potentials that the authors are counting this cost to be the cost to competitiveness because of the labor cost, and given how big the benefit would be if we actually increase competitiveness by reducing bureaucracy and red tape. So right now the goal should be actually, as the authors give it, to raise the public sector, in order to raise the private sector employment, is to actually improve the human resource management in the public sector, and not proceed with further cuts in the public sector, if I read you right. Now, another interesting part of the book that I would like to make a special focus on is the legacy of the 1990-1993 government that is pushed through reforms and created the factors that contributed to a decade of growth, but also they read in its failure to deal with some special interest groups and leaving some reforms have done, the ultimate trouble which led to the fall of the competitiveness, especially within a Eurozone economy, and the tensions that this created for Greece. Finally, I was glad to hear that we do have some potential in the innovation realm, and that actually I found especially interesting their suggestion that we need to collaborate more between the centers of excellence that already exist in universities and the good people we have in quite a few of them in science and business parks, with the business sector, and that could happen through reforming the tertiary education in our universities, enforcing contracts and protecting private property, facilitating the licensing and tax treatment of innovative activities, and encouraging the greater range of economic activities with the university education. So that's it from me for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Katerina. Angele, please.
Good afternoon to all. First of all, I would like to thank the Niarchos Foundation and Brookings for inviting me in this panel. It's an honor to sit next to so many distinguished people. I'm afraid that I do not belong to the optimists' camp in this country. And I'm sure that we should put a question mark on the recovery word that we've seen in the title of that book. I guess that some people, especially in the government, prefer they want recovery, but I also have reservations on that too. Listening to Mr. Pelagidis, whom I know since many years ago as a student, and thinking back to what I have experienced as a journalist covering the crisis since 2009, actually late 2009, there are certain things which come into my mind over and over again. It's not easy to isolate some of these, but I will try to focus my attention on the following 5 points. I hope they are not going to be boring for you and don't sound mundane, but on the contrary, provocative. First, and I think that the book shows this very well, the crisis has highlighted before anything else the lack of serious, structured bureaucratic administration in Greece. Deeply partisan, the Greek governments and the public administration couldn't and deep down did not want to form their own pattern of crisis management after the first inevitable shock of international isolation and the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding in 2010. A fortiori, all Greek governments from 2009 onwards kept reacting to decisions imposed from the outside instead of proposing their own ideas and plans within the framework of the MOU. Second, and related to the previous argument, the main political players, the mainstream political parties, the Vikings, as they also say, were running throughout this period absolutely concerned about their own survival and the survival of the leadership in their own parties, not for the survival of this country. And this didn't depend if they were in power, if they were in the opposition, or if they were in a coalition government. And this had two main consequences. One was that the ruling party, in each case, thought that it could accomplish the main tasks alone. The other consequence was that even if a party considered that the provisions of the MOU and the Troika were wrong, their acceptance was based on its aspirations to stay in power. Of course, there are exceptions to these opinions, but I believe these exceptions simply prove the rule. The third point, and my criticism definitely spares the Minister for Administrative Reform, which is present today here, whom I think belongs to the reformist side. The persistence of consecutive Greek governments in protecting the public sector, with the easy and comfortable exception of cutting wages, was and still is at least scandalous. No plan, no proposal on how we can get modern, flexible, and efficient public administration was ever presented. Still struggling through the joints of the institutions, the terms of redundancy, of mobility, or whatever other fanciful term you may want to use, were actually used to avoid the major issue, that the public sector is overinflated, unproductive, and that, yes, some layoffs are needed. They are needed so that space is made for new, capable people to come in and enhance the human resources in the public sector. It is inconceivable that the rulers in this country accepted the harsh medicine of internal devaluation and ignored the fact that the private sector suffered extremely from unusually high unemployment. The authors used a very interesting term a while ago, financial strangulation of the private sector. Fourthly, the issue of strengthening research and development developed by the authors are, in my opinion, very, very important. We must quickly identify areas that may be associated with centers of innovation and research and to provide very substantial incentives for innovation. The efforts made in Greece by Chinese companies are a good start, and maybe we should identify other areas of high technology. Defense industries, for example, I think we all know that there are, for example, Israeli companies which have already expressed interest in our defense companies. And I think we need to focus on high-end sectors. Tourism is not anymore the solution. A fifth and final point relates to the role of Europe, and I think it answers to what Mr. Borrell said a while ago and why Mr. Trichet did not say in 2010 what Mario Draghi said in 2012. Unfortunately, what was proven during the current crisis was that the EU has ceased to be a community of values. It's mostly built around the community of interests. Personally, I doubt if it ever was different. And allow me to quote Stanley Hoffman, that maybe some in this room know. An international system, in this case the European system, based on fragmentation, tends, through the dynamics of unevenness, to reproduce its diversity. In this crisis, power is proven to be the basic guiding principle of the European project. In this relentless chessboard, Athens, as a weak link, had little room for maneuver, not just for building alliances, but also for sympathy on the part of its powerful partners, who precisely because of this imbalance mentioned above, impose their own conditions, reinforcing at the same time the diversity and differentiation within the community. This trend will continue, I believe, with the formation of a Europe of concentric, parallel, or as you prefer everyone to name it, cycles, and it's time for Greece to decide in which cycle it will belong. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the panelists. It is getting late. So I have one question to ask, and then for the panelists to respond briefly, and then I would like to open the floor to questions from the audience. Having participated in the previous meetings in Berlin and Madrid, and having attended the roundtable conversation earlier today, I think it is fair to assume that the debate on European cohesion and transfer payments is the central debate in this issue when we talk about the crisis in the EU zone and the crisis in Greece. And I remember at the last meeting in Berlin, the German economists were adamant about the fact that when we talk about transfer payments and we talk about European cohesion, the German public and German politicians were willing to go as far as banking consolidation. That's all. That's where the debate should stop, that the issue of transfer payments was unpalatable to the German public. Earlier today, Hans-Peter Gruner, who is a professor of economics at the University of Mannheim, mentioned the following, that Greece ought to be congratulated for the fact that it has undertaken reforms at an unprecedented scale, that these reforms would have been very difficult to achieve or even to implement in Germany. That one should perhaps consider transfer payments in a case where a country has been successful in undertaking and implementing very difficult structural reforms. He also mentioned that something that was very, very important, that the time has come to move on now to Italy and France. And it's time for both of those countries to start cleaning their own house. That's a very important part of the European debate. So I would like, and I think this whole issue relates very much to what has been discussed here all day and to the book, and I would like the panelists to comment on this very briefly, please.
Could you please repeat the last phrase because you were writing down
Which part of it?
the last one?
I would like you to consider the fact that, as it was mentioned this morning, that it's time now to move on from Greece to Italy and France. That has become an important part of the debate on the EU crisis.
Initially, our stance on the Greek crisis was that Greece is an acute case of problems that the whole of Europe has. Greece was a very small part of Europe with very acute problems, but big countries have the same problems. I was in another discussion a couple of days ago. Someone said that now that Europe has stuck together during the crisis, the worst is over, and my reaction was that the slow grinding process of low growth, high unemployment, and no vision for the people to believe in the future might be more dangerous than the acute storm. So I think, and I believed at the beginning, and I still believe now, that what is happening in Greece is a test bed for what Europe has in front of it. And in that sense, looking into the policy mistakes that have been made in Greece and how Mr. Kemal pointed out, policy mistakes can make things worse. That's probably also the reason why the Americans were so quick to react after the signs of collapse in 2008, in 2007, and the lesson is that you need to get the policies right, and I think it has been clear from the discussion now here and also earlier that there are serious missing elements from the European construct, and even though a lot of things have been put in place after the crisis, keystones of the building are still missing. So I would say that the urgency to address the crisis at, say, countries like France or Italy, given the experience of Greece, is now even more pressing and urgent. And the doctrine of thinking within the box and being cautious about the solutions has proven to have huge risks. And time has come to do what we have been afraid in Europe to do in the past years. It is, we have to move fast ahead towards unification, to put the building blocks that are remaining there in place, because it is the only way to avoid, as Mr. De Vries has been saying, by moving fast on some issues like deposit insurance, for example, you might end up not having to pay the cost. So that's true on a much broader scale. And I would say that the message that, you know, okay, we have stabilized Greece, now we can go back to business as usual on the European bureaucracy, it's basically the most scary thing I have seen in the past, say, couple of months.
Thank you. Kemal, perhaps?
No, I agree very much with what Michael said. I think the danger of saying that everything is fine now that the acute crisis is past and the Eurozone can relax in its institutional reform efforts is a real danger, and we don't know from where the next crisis may come. We didn't predict the one in 2008, so there's no evidence that we really know how to predict what will happen. And the other thing is that the very chronic low growth scenario is, from a social and political point of view, perhaps at least as dangerous as an acute crisis, because at the time of an acute crisis, families, people have small savings, there are some things you can use up to resist, you know, to stay alive. But if the unemployment and the low income continues for many years, then all the reserves of poor families or lower middle income families are exhausted. Having said that, I still persist to say that there are signs of rebound in the Greek economy and in the Spanish economy, and you know, and that if the right things are done, I don't think that we could have a fairly impressive period. I mean, not of Chinese growth, you know, but I think 3% 2.5%, 3.5% growth is not beyond reach in the Southern European space. And there, as you know, there's a lot of investment interest. But that has to be channeled in such a way that it creates growth for a large number of people, not just for a small group. Special efforts have to be deployed for employment in middle and small enterprises, for young people. I mean, a lot needs to be done. But there is interest. I mean, Southern Europe is now an area in the world where investors are showing interest, and I think that is a good sign. And on the final thing on Europe, and this is not our debate here, you know, if the architecture becomes too complex, it cannot be democratic. So there is need to simplify it to some degree in such a way that, you know, citizens can relate to it. If what goes on in Brussels is incomprehensible, you know, if I as an economist have to spend weeks trying to figure out what the latest developments are, then I think the democratic process is in danger. So one has to find ways to structure and to project Europe in its basic forms in a rather simple way. And then, of course, the technical details, I mean, that's not an issue. Normal citizens don't have to understand all of that. And it's here that I do believe that Europe has to solve its United Kingdom problem. In other words, I think it should be part of Europe, but maybe of two concentric circles, the inner circle, the Eurozone circle, and an outer circle containing the United Kingdom. An institutional setup that wants to satisfy both the United Kingdom's desire to be very sovereign and kind of apart and minimally integrated, and the need for the Eurozone to be much more integrated, I think is impossible to achieve. You cannot satisfy London and the Eurozone at the same time with the same institutions. So there is need for differentiation, and you know, maybe we'll have another conference one day on that topic.
Thanks, Kemal. Yes, please.
A couple of things to what has just Michael said, that regarding the Mediterranean countries, Greece and Spain.
Be brief, please, because we're running out of time, so we can have questions from the audience.
Minutes here. Yeah. They still face the following couple of, you know, common risks, which is first that the euro is a hard currency both for Greece and for Spain and for Portugal and for Italy maybe. And this is a question mark about monetary policy, which is implemented by the ECB. And the second common risk and danger that all these, let's say, Mediterranean countries they face is that the surplus countries of Northern Europe denied to reflate within the Eurozone. And the immediate consequence of that is that they have gathered a large part of available liquidity in the Eurozone. So the Greek and the Spanish and the Italian enterprises face quite different costs from the German and the Austrian and the Scandinavian enterprises. So this is something which is make us to be a little bit pessimistic about the not so distant future. As for Greece, the institutional weakness, the backwardness in education system, in taxation, in the welfare system is still there. We believe it's still there, and this is the reason we are so skeptical or so pessimistic right now. So,
thank you, Katerina. Angele.
I'd like to make just one point on it's quite encouraging that we have some German economists and policymakers actually warming up to the idea of transfers in exchange for structural reforms. And we've heard the same thing actually as an idea for debt easing. I would be more optimistic about that if I could see the same resolve for structural reforms within Greece as well. So this will be a challenge for the next few years.
Thank you, Angele.
A very quick one. It's encouraging we have a German economist talking about fiscal transfers, but it's discouraging we have Herman Van Rompuy as president of the European Council. I don't know if you have followed the leaks about his latest strategic advice about the next Commission. There's nothing about fiscal transfers building blocks about the euro area architecture is only more or less what the UK wants, which is actually surprising to me. We had calls from France and Italy for some easing of the Stability Pact, but then all these discussions stopped after German insistence, as far as I know. Thank you.
Joseph, any comments? So we can close. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Europe has to choose between more political integration or less economic integration. The standby is not feasible. Either you want to keep an euro monetary union, then you have to integrate politically more. You are unable or unwilling to go further on the political integration, then you have to go backwards in economic integration. This is, to my understanding, the best expertise or the thing that we have learned from this crisis. No? The idea of having a common monetary policy and 18 different fiscal policies and 18 different banking systems and 18 different public debts with whom the speculation can play at will, it hasn't worked and it will not work. So either we go further on political integration, either we have to accept that we have to go backwards. And all countries at the same time will not go further for more political integration. Some of them will go. So, as Kemal said, we have to make a differentiation of at least two circles. The ones who really want to become a political union and a monetary union, and the others who doesn't want to play this game. And in this case, we will be good neighbors, we'll have good cooperation relationships, we'll be part of a union, but let's put things clear, because if not, we will continue muddling through with a heavy or maybe unaffordable social cost for some countries like Greece and Spain.
Thank you. At this point, I would like to thank the speakers and the panelists and open the floor to questions. Please ask questions, avoid statements. Be brief and precise. We do not have a lot of time. The gentleman in the back, identify yourself and...
Hi, my name is Art Demopoulos. I'm Executive Director of the National Hellenic Society. And just, it's not a statement, but my Greek doctor, like Hippocrates, who never asked if I was a Republican or Democrat, said, "You've got to lose weight. You've got to run like Bill Antholis and watch what you eat. And it's up to the patient to take the advice," or he said, "You're going to have a heart attack and die." And I commend the Niarchos Foundation for having fantastic doctors that are telling Greece, here's what you got to do. Now, it's up to the patient to take the advice or die. Will Greece take that advice is my question.
Thank you. Any responses from the panelists?
I have one...
Government members to take the advice.
Yes, one response to that we hear that a lot also from Europeans. They said, you know, you voted for them, you have to implement the reforms. Sometimes the patient is not in a capacity on his own to follow the advice of the doctor and needs, let's say, technical assistance, but effective technical assistance to do that and guidance. So it might be politically correct to say, you know, this is the prescription, now you have to follow it. Sometimes, yes, it's correct, but it's not going to happen by itself. And that's the whole question about nation building and institutions and all that. It's not the context of this response. I simply want to add, also extending on the previous intervention, that if we get things right in Greece and in Europe, there is so much to gain, and maybe in the crisis we have missed out on that. And we should not forget what is there out to gain. I mean, it's really great what we could achieve.
More questions, please. Yes, the gentleman right there with the glasses.
Hello, my name is Menelos Zafalias. I'm a freelance journalist. Two questions, one for Mr. Borrell and one for Mr. Dervis and whomever would like to respond. Mr. Borrell, Spain was in a very good position before the crisis struck and now isn't. So what exactly can we learn from that today when Spain is being told the same kind of things that Greece is being told? And Mr. Dervis, you reformed Turkey, and in many ways what you put in place has helped Turkey gain its place in the world today. And then all the political system which you were part of up to a point at the time sort of vanished. So what experiences can we draw from that? Must we have total change so we can have actual change?
Thank you for this question. Well, what proves what has happened is that not all problems are fiscal problems. The Maastricht Treaty was only paying attention to fiscal deficits and public debt. Nothing was said about the other parameters of the economy. And from this point of view, Spain and Ireland were the best pupils of the Maastricht class because they had surplus, public surplus, and less than 40% of public debt. Better? Impossible. Much better than Germany. And in spite of that, when the crisis came, in less than 1 year, we went from heaven to hell due to the fact that the fundamentals of our economy were very weak. In the case of Ireland, an hypertrophy of the banking system plus a bubble, and in our case, more or less the same thing, a housing bubble and a bad performing of the financial system. So the Stability Pact was badly designed because it was only paying attention to the parameters of the public sector. Today, this has been solved, more or less, because the macroeconomic surveillance pays also attention to other parameters like external surplus, the behavior of the private economy, and so and so. But at that moment, Spain, everybody was talking about the Spanish model. Do you remember the Spanish model? My God, what a model. But in the year 2007, we were a model because we were growing at 4%, we were absorbing 4 million immigrants, we had a surplus in the social security system, surplus on the fiscal side, very, very low debt. Nobody was paying attention to the fact that we had a 12% of the GNP of external deficit, trade deficit, because it was not on the Stability Pact. It was not on the convergence criteria. Only the public sector could behave badly. Well, this was a big, big, big mistake. We learned it, and now let's say that there are ways of having a look at the behavior of the private sector. And since the crisis started in Greece, everybody understood the crisis as a fiscal crisis. And to Spain was applied exactly the same medicine that to the Greek patient. It is a fiscal crisis, austerity. It was not a fiscal crisis, but nevertheless, everybody was being under the same therapy. What would have happened if the crisis started in Ireland instead of in Greece? Because 6 months later, or less than 6 months later, Ireland went into crisis. Had the crisis started in Ireland, what would have been the diagnosis of the crisis?
It didn't make any difference. I mean, the medicine was the same. Yeah.
Yes, but they could not have said this is a problem of fiscal indiscipline, because Ireland was not a problem of fiscal indiscipline. The diagnosis would have been different. Would the therapy been different also? I don't know. But the narrative of the crisis is, you see, these people from the south are indisciplined people. They run in public deficits. So the solution has to come from a big austerity measures. This would have not been possible to explain. The narrative would not have been possible if the crisis had started in Ireland. And happily, Papandreou recognized to have a very strong deficit some months before that the bubble burst in Ireland.
Well, let me just add I mean, I'll answer the question, make some remarks on Turkey afterwards, but you know, the same was really true for the Asian crisis in '97. The Asian public sector deficits were very low. It was a current account management and exchange rate management problem because they were trying to keep their currencies constant vis-a-vis the dollar, and large current accounts were not considered a problem because there were large capital inflows. But the minute the capital inflows stopped, you had the Asian crisis. The same happened, by the way, in Mexico in 1994 with the tequila crisis. Mexico did not have a large fiscal deficit, but it had a very large current account deficit. But again, it was financed, you know, by the private sector. So underneath is an excessive and kind of unbalanced belief that that things that are due to private decisions somehow can't be wrong, whereas things that are due to public decisions can be much more wrong. So I mean, they can both be wrong. We've learned that. And I think the Spanish example is another major you know, case in point. On Turkey, I don't want to go into details, but there was a major crisis in 2001, 2002. The reforms were done very quickly and very decisively at that time, and I think that helped a lot. I have one, I always say to my friends, one advice I got from a very wise boss I had when I was young was he told me, look, if you're in trouble and if there's a crisis and you have some responsibility, take your losses up front. Don't wait. Just do all the tough stuff right away. And I think that was very good advice. And I think that is partly why the reform in Turkey, there was a huge collapse in 2001, but growth was again close to 8% in 2002. But you know, with reform, it's like with good eating habits or exercise. You have to keep doing it. You cannot expect a reform that was done, you know, 12 years ago, 13 years ago, to carry you for 20 years. Reform is an ongoing process. The world changes, circumstances change, and you have to keep adapting. It's just like an enterprise, a corporation in the private sector cannot do one major reform and then say for the next 20 years we're okay. And unfortunately, you know, in the last few years, there has indeed been a weakening of that ongoing reform process. But it remains a very dynamic economy.
Couple of more questions, please. Gentleman back there.
Yeah, my name is Michael Masourakis, and I want to ask my friends, the authors of the book, what it would take, actually, to put an exclamation mark next to the recovery. Thank you.
Michael, you tell us. You are so optimist, and we are very happy to read your weekly.
Let me add one more thing.
Oh, okay.
What would be the time dimension if we had chosen another route?
As we said before, we would like to see more structural reforms since the beginning of the program, and that was critical, as we said before, because our view is that we lost critical time, especially the period 2010-2012 was a clear disaster, and have to add this to this, the disastrous Brexit talk that deteriorated the thing so much. So more structural reforms at the beginning. And the way to do that was that the creditor could have pressed the government to do the right thing and not wait and wait and wait. And then the PSI 2 comes, and you know all the disastrous things have been done with the PSI 2, included the banks and the universities and all the other things, the negative side effects. As for the time dimension, I would like to say the same thing. I would like to see what Kemal has said, to take our losses up front and to have maybe a haircut since the beginning, since inception of the crisis, and then match this with structural reforms, and then we would have maybe a better result. But being obsessed with wage cuts and always trying to gain competitiveness through this kind of path, having, for example, for the 3 first years of the program, 2010-2012, a cumulative inflation rate of 10%, that was a dead end for us, and that brought the negative results we have experienced. The first 2 years of the crisis, especially.
One more question, the gentleman there, and we're done. Thank you.
My name is... My name is Papadopoulos, Konstantin Papadopoulos. I work for a bank. I'm an economist. I'd like to ask those members of the panel who advocate the introduction of fiscal transfers in the Eurozone, what exactly they mean. Do they mean permanent transfers of income from the richer countries to the poor countries, or do they mean a mechanism whereby the Eurozone as a whole can confront idiosyncratic, country-specific, asymmetrical shocks from the center? Because if it's the latter, I think we already have the ESM, which presumably will get built up over time. Thank you.
I think we talked about automatic stabilizers and not the kind of system we have in Germany, for example. We have a federal system with automatic stabilizers. This is the meaning of fiscal federalism.
I think it's mostly the latter, but the fact that the ESM has been introduced so slowly and reluctantly has really cost this country, for sure. So, yes, it's obviously some system of guarantees in case they're needed would have worked wonders earlier on in the crisis. That's what I meant anyway. Thank you.
Let me add, I think it is mainly the latter, although I'm not sure the ESM is quite yet in that position. The German Constitutional Court's kind of deference to the European Court was a good thing, but it would even be better if the European Court clearly said that OTM was okay. So there's still some doubts, and in fact, in our meeting this morning, some colleagues had doubt that the outright monetary transactions could actually take place if they had to, because of some of the legal problems in Germany. So we're not quite there yet. But 2 points, bottom line points here. If you neutralize your risk, and if you pool your risk, you know that it is reduced, okay? So if instead of facing Italian risk, German risk, Danish risk, Greek risk, an investor faces Eurozone risk with stronger economies, which at times were weaker, Germany 10 years ago was not as strong as today, then I think what you have to pay for risk is lower, without need for transfers. And I think this is one thing that, again and again, I feel like taking leave from Brookings and doing a 6-month travel in Germany to try to get this across to the public opinion, that it's not just about transfers, it's about mutualizing and getting together to manage risk. But on the other hand, some limited transfers, if you have a common currency, are limited, not in a major way, to finance from the European budget or the Eurozone budget, some education programs, some environmental programs, maybe a certain part of the unemployment, catastrophic unemployment insurance and so on, I think are totally manageable. They don't require a huge amount of resources, and they would give the message that there is a Europe of citizens, that there is a social contract also at the Eurozone level, where you can actually get some concrete benefits that are linked to you being a European citizen. And I think that's important in terms of the European demos that has to be created. As I said, it won't work with the United Kingdom. And that's fine. I mean, they are perfectly free to say no to that. And that's why we need to, I mean, Turkey is a different question, we'll discuss it another day, but we need to create a Europe where those who want to be part of that demos can be, and those who don't have to be, but can cooperate in a more wider framework. And here is something, I don't know whether I mentioned it this afternoon again, but it's a very interesting kind of message I find, that the leader of the left opposition in Greece, Alexis Tsipras, who probably has nothing in common politically with Jean-Claude Juncker, but actually said he's supporting the presidency of Jean-Claude Juncker as president of the Commission, which is a very clear message from the Greek left that it is European, and it wants a European demos, a European political space. And in that sense, I think that it was an extremely good move.
Thank you. I would like to thank the speakers and the panelists, as well as the audience, for joining us in a beautiful summer day. Good evening to all. Thank you.